War Beneath the Roots is a fantasy fiction podcast. While rooted in tabletop storytelling, this is a fully written narrative crafted for audio. Video versions are available to enhance the experience with maps and art, but they're not necessary. This podcast contains violence and themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. She stood at the heart of the ancient grove. Ancient trunks bowed before her will. Roots writhed like serpents in the loam. Fungal veins pulsed beneath splintered bark. Around her, horrors arrived, delivered. Dragons crowned in mold, their wings mottled with decay. Canine monstrosities, fur matted in rot, teeth shimmering with toxin. Insect horrors skittered across shattered stones. Each creature knelt at her touch. Beneath the tangled canopy, each breath felt stolen, as though even the wind belonged to her will. She lifted a single finger. A silent decree rippled through every leaf and scale. The grove exhaled a pustulant haze, seeding pestilence upon the breeze. Black tendrils from the moss claimed fallen oaks. Shadows thickened, hungry and alive. Branches cracked like bone as the ancient wood began walking. Roots upturned ancient gravestones. Fungal blossoms burst in crimson profusion. This, her ever-growing legion. Then the air tore open with thunderous roars. True dragons, scales ablaze like the rising sun, rumbled up from the ridge, some low, some high. Perfect formation. They thundered into the clearing, preparing their great mouths. At their forefront, the old man from her dream sat atop a golden dragon. Light blazing in his outstretched hand, roots recoiled, spore-choked beasts faltered. Her smile curved in triumph. The grove sighed, waiting her command. I am Benjamin Harris. Welcome to War Beneath the Roots. Chapter 15. Markin led the way up the narrow valley, the sky paling behind them as, finally, the Medi outpost came into view. What should have been a bastion of order lay smothered beneath the Bloom's hungry fingers. Ramparts of blackened stone bulged with twisted roots. Turrets dripped with phosphorescent slime. The tattered standard, once bearing the Medi sun, hung shredded, its gold threads entwined in fungal mycelium. By all the gods, Blue thundered, shouldering his axe. It's like the fortress itself is rotting alive. Dr. Korik knelt to inspect a creeping tendril that snaked through the embrasure. She adjusted a lens attached to her wrist rig, eyes flicking over the spore clusters with clinical fascination. Remarkable, she breathed. It's as if the bloom has grafted itself into the stonework, compromising the load-bearing arches entirely. Markin squinted at a battered sign, half swallowed by vines. The word Medi loomed in peeling letters. This is it. Behind them, the refugees huddled among scrub pines, watching with hollow eyes. Their renewed bodies had found little peace in this land of creeping death. Markin met Korik's gaze. We can't drag them through that, he said quietly. If we breach now, we risk burying everyone under that stone. Korik tapped her chin. We need a plan and a safe perimeter. Blue's jaw clenched. Let them wait here. Set watch rotations. Beam nodded, sending a faint pulse of green spores drifting around the refugees like a living ward. Protection. Calming. Camp's here, Markin announced. We'll keep you out of range. Rest, gather strength. We'll map the walls tonight, and at first light, find a way in. As the group fell into guarded formation, the outpost's shadow stretched long and malignant across the clearing, an unspoken challenge daring them to reclaim it. The fire guttered low, embers drifting like dying sparks into the starless sky. Around its glow, weary bodies huddled close, refugees wrapped in thinning blankets, their breaths shallow. Markin poked at a stick, and then let it fall into the coals. Blue lounged nearby, massive axe resting across broad thighs. Beam sat rooted, soft spores spiraling from his roots. Markin exhaled, meeting the Minotaur's steady gaze. "You asked why I keep fighting," he rasped. "My mother and my sisters, Cassandra and little Alice, arrived in Kita just weeks ago, I guess, chasing the promise of citizenship. We had nothing but Mother's hymns and her relentless hope. I scrubbed tavern floors, I sold herbs in the market, anything to keep food on our table." He shifted, rubbing a faded scar on his forearm. "I never knew my father. Every time I asked, Mother would smile and clamp her lips shut, as though his name were poison." Blue leaned forward, bracing on his elbows. "Interesting. Did she ever speak of him?" Markin's gaze flickered to the dancing flames. "When Alice fell ill, racked by fever and trembling beyond any healer's cure, Mother confided that his blood flows through me, that I carry something dangerous. But she never named him. By the time we reached Kita's gates, Alice was gone. Mother threw herself into every task she could find. I vowed to earn enough coin to keep us all safe. I still don't understand what I inherited, or if it has to do with this magic." A sudden cackle drew their eyes to Dr. Korik, who stood at the fire's edge. Her wrist rig flickered in the firelight, readings spilling across its gauges. "Markin," she called, voice urgent but hushed. "Come, observe. This bloom density, it's unprecedented. These values eclipse every specimen I cataloged in Blackwell, and even outstrip the densest epicenters of Midborg's contamination." She tapped the rig. Motes of spore dust drifted over the flames. "If this fortress operates as a mycelial nexus, it explains the outpost's swift capitulation, and compels us to relocate the refugees at once." Markin rose, shoulders squared. "Show me." Korik held out the rig, the glow from her gauges like a silent alarm. The camp settled into uneasy silence beneath a sky choked by spores. Each watch began with a cough of fungal wind, a wet, rasping sigh that felt alive. At regular intervals, something shifted deep in the undergrowth. A wet crack, a distant scrape. The air was thick with a coppery tang and the acrid stench of decay. No one slept deeply. Markin kept vigil first, lantern at his side, eyes never still. Beam sat across the embers, his roots curled beneath him, faint pulses of green light leaking from his bark. Blue drifted in the watch rotation like a silent sentinel, axe in hand, nostrils flaring at every new stink. Dr. Korik hovered near her instruments, measuring the bloom's radiance in the dark. When dawn's gray light bled through the trees, Markin summoned the group. "We move on my mark," he said, voice raw. "Beam, you lead. Burn through that barricade of rot at the front gate. We'll guard you." Beam rose, limbs creaking. From his limbs spilled a churning cloud of phosphorescent spores, fierce as acid, hot as embers. The spores pulsed. Ready. Slow. Careful. He advanced on the fungal wall, smothering the gate, spores hissing into its throat. Blue squared his shoulders. "Whatever's in there, we hold it off." Two of the refugees, a tall woman from Midborg with fungal scars and a grizzled Malcian ex-soldier, stepped forward. "Let us fight," the woman rasped. "You saved us. We'll save you." The soldier nodded, fists clenched. Dr. Korik strapped on her kit, a playful smile at her lips. "Ready," she said as she handed the ex-soldier a device similar to her mechanical appendage. Markin met their eyes. "We stand by Beam. No one gets past us, and no one gets to Beam." The first spores struck the bloom with a hiss like blood on hot iron. Around them the fortress loomed, dead stone dripping with rot, waiting to swallow them whole, and they stormed forward into the maw of decay. The moment Beam's spores slammed into the fungus-choked gate, the stones shuddered and split as living horrors spilled out. The blackened wood and iron groaned as the rot peeled back like flesh. Beneath it, a twitching mass of tendrils writhed, burrowing into the stone. Markin surged forward, bow drawn. Each footfall sank into pulsing mycelium that oozed and tugged at his boots, an insatiable carpet of rot. Suddenly, a fungal stalk snapped across his ribs like a cracked whip, flesh tearing. He tasted iron as poison seeped into the wound, and he bit back the urge to collapse. Blue let out a bestial roar, charging a 5-limbed monstrosity, its carcass a swollen haze of spores and flensing bone. His axe cleaved through the fungal armor with a sickening crack, but the creature's head split, only to reveal a churning mass of smaller, wriggling tendrils that lashed at him. Gasping, he staggered back, blood spattering the phosphorescent hooks, wrenching free before they could burrow deeper. At Coric's side, the scarred refugee woman drove her blade into a malformed hound oozing virid ichor. The ex-soldier raised Coric's device. As he pressed the button, jets of fire exploded from the front of it, burning all manner of creature, the living floor, and screaming things that hadn't yet been seen. From behind them, a wave of fungus-scarred militia emerged from a living wall. Their twisted screams echoed like shattered bells. Coric darted between stricken fighters, pressing tinctures to their cursed wounds, her lens rig flickering warnings as the bloom's density spiked. "Markin, overhead!" she hissed. Above them, wooden beams sprouted barbed pods that burst, rupturing in a hail of acidic spores. Beam roared, expelling a surge of cleansing light that washed over and began eating through creatures all around him. But the blast left him panting, his bark skin cracked. Behind him, the gate lay in smoldering ruin, yet beyond it, the courtyard had become a writhing hive. The ground buckled, spores blossomed into grotesque flowers whose pollen poisoned the air. Markin's heart hammered in his chest as every step carried him deeper into this nightmare. He could almost hear Cassandra's voice echo in the spores, begging for him to turn back. He surveyed the carnage. 2 refugees slumped, their armor melting into their flesh, Blue swaying, eyes glassy with acute infection. Coric's lips were chalk white. He swallowed. The bloom was not merely an enemy, it was a living divinity of rot, and they had trespassed in its cathedral. There was no retreat, only the grim calculus of survival. Beam roared again, this time his guttural roar warped into something not entirely his own. Green phosphorescence pulsed through his veins as bark split into blackened chitin. His spores exploded several feet in all directions, pulsing. Together. Steady. Fear. His limbs elongated, one arm branching into a club of razor-sharp splinters, the other tipping into a writhing mass of fungal tendrils. His eyes became pits of molten ember. He charged into the heaving mass with the force of a cataclysm. His newly sprouted tendrils whipped like barbed whips, slicing through armor and sinew with a wet, ripping gasp. One massive fist, now a gnarled flail of chitin and thorns, smashed into a fungal centurion, buried in its own spore-webbed cuirass, shattering the abomination's carapace and spraying a geyser of virulent ichor across the courtyard stones. Every swing sent tremors through the ground, cracking the mycelial carpet and uprooting living pod trees with such violence that their acidic sap hissed and bubbled against the broken pavement. He pivoted on clawed toes, launching himself at a swarm of twisted militia, each member a grotesque fusion of man and fungus, Writhing tendrils erupted from his shoulders, coiling around the nearest creature, crushing bone in a single inexorable squeeze. Sparks of phosphorescence pulsed as he tore the beast apart, its screaming torso collapsing into a semi-solid heap of spores and blood. Even Blue and the refugees hacking through the peripheral swarm froze for a split second at the sheer carnage, Coric's tincture-laden hand trembling over a scalpel as she fought to maintain composure. In that moment, Beam's roar shook their bones, and they braced themselves for the living nightmare of rage he had become. Beam sent shockwaves of spores throughout the courtyard, splintering stone and fungal growth alike. But as he swung his chitin flail, the bloom lurking in his wound surged, its throat-deep infection roaring to claim him. Bark cracked open like a shattered carapace, spore-frothed ichor pouring from the rifts. His silhouette warped grotesquely. A third arm burst from his torso, a writhing mass of barbed tendrils, each tipped with glowing fungal hooks. His legs lengthened, joints bending at unnatural angles, roots snaking from his heels to grip the slick, rot-laced stones. The crown of his head split into a halo of venomous spore pods, each pulsing with malevolent light. Through it all, his eyes burned brighter like ruby fire, a furious beacon of the bloom's triumph. Blue charged, axe raised in a berserker's roar, but Beam's new tendrils lashed out, ensnaring the Minotaur's blade and wrenching it aside. The impact sent Blue skidding across the courtyard, armor gouged by chitin splinters. He rolled to his feet, but as he leaned on the ex-soldier for a second, Beam's bulk crashed into him, sending the refugee clattering into the undergrowth, swallowed. His spores pulsed a deep, dark green. Churning. Pain. Death. Dr. Coric rushed forward, tinctures at the ready, chanting protocols under her breath. She slashed a poisoned tendril with her blade, but the wound knit instantly, the bloom's lifeblood staving off her cure, drawing power from Beam. Her eyes flicked to her wrist rig, where readings spiked beyond the gauge's maximum. "Beam!" she cried, voice cracking with both fear and wonder. The scarred woman from Midborg struck at the lesser horrors that spilled from the gate's wreckage. Each swing of her blades cut down malformed militia, but for every corpse she felled, 2 more oozy abominations slithered out of the spreading hive. Beam staggered, head lolled back as if to howl, but only a gurgle escaped. His spore pods ruptured in a final testament of defiance, scattering toxin pollen into the air. He fell to one knee, tendrils dragged him toward the bloom's marred stones, as though the ground itself demanded him as sacrifice. His great form trembled, shoulders sagging under the weight of infection. Markin's scream tore through the chaos. He extended both hands toward his friend. Time itself rippled under his gaze. The air hummed, embers lifted, and reality bent. With a thunderous crack, the courtyard reversed. Stone shattered, reformed. Beam straightened, spores withdrew into their pods, and Beam's tortured body uncoiled, the malformed limbs receding into solid bark, the crown of pods sealing like unbroken armor. Everything but the bloom itself, renewed. But the spell's violence tore at Markin's own flesh. He staggered, blood trickling from his ears, vision swimming as he fell backward against a crumbling pillar. Behind him, the freed Beam cried out, this time a defiant triumph rather than agony, and lunged into the fray anew. With fewer abominations and the remaining now disoriented by the temporal reversal, Blue waded in, axe singing a brutal dirge. The refugee pressed the attack beside Coric, whose tinctures now took root, stalling the bloom's advance. Together they carved a path back to the gate. When the last fungal horror fell, the courtyard's living floor began to shudder. The fungal mat, once an unbroken sea of pulsating mycelium, rippled in concentric waves, as though some colossal heartbeat had skipped. They stumbled back, eyes widening as great fissures yawned in the rot-slick stones. With a muted groan, the entire surface gave way. A 30-foot maw split the courtyard, swallowing armies of spores and corrupted militia in a single earth-shaking gulp. Roots and bricks tumbled into the void, chased by drifts of glowing smoke that spiraled down into the darkness. Blue halted at the brink, his body dripping profusely into the yawning tunnel, its walls slick with bioluminescent veins pulsing in a ghostly violet and amber. The shaft descended into the earth on an angle, twisting and narrowing slightly as it vanished beyond sight. It looked less like architecture and more like the world's own bleeding artery, an ancient canal carved by some great worm. Korik pressed a hand to her rig, the readings dropping. Blue gripped his axe, knuckles white. Markin swallowed, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing in on them. The bloom had not just overtaken the fortress. It had burrowed into the very marrow of the world, and somehow in that Stygian tunnel lay the source of its dark communion. The courtyard lay silent save for labored breaths and the soft hiss of dissipating spores. Beam stood at last at Markin's side, chest heaving, bark skin cracked but unbowed. His spores settled gently in the air around them. Regret. Grateful. Love. Blue knelt, pressing a hand to his friend's shoulder. Korik wrapped a trembling hand around Markin's arm, her gaze a mixture of awe and concern. Markin sat, the aftershocks of his spell echoing through his body. Each time he'd bent the currents of time, he felt it strip at his edges, veins of pain lacing through his skull, his vision blurring as if the world itself rejected his theft of moments. He pressed his hand to the earth, feeling time's fractured seam close behind him. They had reclaimed the outpost, but the cost was written in every tremor of his bones. Chapter 16. They hauled Markin to his feet, supporting him on either side as he shook off the last tremors of his temporal exertion. His vision swam, but Korik pressed a cooling poultice to his temples and murmured precise instructions until his pulse steadied. Blue offered a grunt of encouragement, and Beam stood silent sentinel, spores drifting over Markin's shoulders like a protective cloak. With Markin steady, the party fanned out through the hushed corridors of the outpost. Turrets gaped like broken teeth overhead. Halls were choked with slow creeping rot, easily destroyed by Beam and Dr. Korik's concoctions. In what must once have been the barracks, Korik's lantern glinted off a battered iron chest. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the Guardian's crest and Cassandra's name scrawled in looping script. They gathered around as Markin opened it. Entry 1. I can scarcely believe it. Today I was accepted by the Guardians. They welcomed me with open arms, spoke of honor and duty, and entrusted me with a pilgrimage to the old forests. My heart thrums with purpose. I will walk beneath those ancient boughs and prove myself worthy of their trust. Entry 7. The forest is more alive than I ever imagined. The giants sway like living columns, and I've recorded unfamiliar blooms that glow beneath moonlight. Each night I feel their whisper in my blood, yet I remain steadfast. I know this journey will shape me into the guardian I aspire to be. Final entry. I've returned to the outpost at dusk, eager to share my discoveries, but something went wrong. In the old grove, nature was silent. I found patches of black fungus pulsating like wounded flesh. I approached. Curiosity compelled me, and it reacted. I fled as a ring of fungus shot up around me, snapping at my heels. I think it grazed my arm. There's a spot where my skin stings, and I can feel it. Something. I burned everything, but I can still hear the forest whispering. Markin's fingers trembled as he read her final words. But I can still hear the forest whispering, and for a heartbeat he swore he heard a rasp of spores in the silence. Whatever Cassandra encountered there, it had been the bloom's reach. But how had she survived it so long? Dusk's gray light found them back at the edge of the tree line, where the refugees huddled against the chill. Their faces, once hopeful, now were hard and hollow. Marken approached slowly, Korik and Blue flanking him, Beam's spores hovering like a pale mist behind. Marken cleared his throat. "We ventured inside the outpost. We found Cassandra's journal." He let that hang, watching their reactions. Some clutched blankets tighter, others stared at the mossy ground. Korik spoke gently. "I regret to inform you that the ex-soldier succumbed to it. Despite our concerted efforts, we were unable to extricate him." Her voice trailed off. An older woman's cry shattered the silence. "You let him die? After everything?" Her grip on her walking staff tightened until knuckles showed white. She shook with fury and grief. "His name was Jagora. Did you even know his name?" The tall Malcian, once resolute, turned his hollow gaze to the trees. "We have faith in your strength, but we cannot follow you to our deaths." A murmur rose among the group, accusations, bitter farewells. Without another word, the refugees gathered their few belongings and slipped eastward, down the trail, leaving smoke-stained footprints in the ash-littered earth, their departure the final fracture in the fragile alliance. Marken's jaw clenched as the refugees turned away. "I should have saved him," he muttered under his breath, guilt coiling in his gut. He watched them go until their ragged procession shrank to specks among the pines. He straightened, shoulders heavy. Korik pressed a hand to his arm. "What now?" He drew Cassandra's journal from his pack. "We could head northwest, where she first found the bloom." His voice was gravel and steel. "I don't know that we'll find her, but we'll at least know how this all began." Beam convulsed as his tired form shifted once more, muscles knitting into equine grace. His bark erupted into a sleek, mossy coat, legs tapering into powerful hooves. Blue secured the improvised sled, Korik's instruments and their scant provisions, binding the leather straps to Beam. Without a further exchange of words, Blue vaulted into the saddle. The war horse's heavy flanks quivered beneath him as they pivoted toward the forest's shadowed edge. Marken and Korik shared a solemn glance, her lens rig flickering with calculated resolve, then moved to flank their transformed companion. Together they set off along Cassandra's last known trail, Beam's steady gallop echoing on the hollow ground, Blue's silhouette cutting through the murk, and Marken and Korik falling into stride. Korik tapped her wrist rig, amber lights dancing. "If Cassandra survived, her trajectory may well be homeward." Marken closed the journal, determination hardening his features. "If she endured this long, there's still hope. But first we return to the grove where she found the bloom." Moss-choked roots clawed at the horse's hooves as the party plunged into the bloom-infested woods. No path remained, just a shifting sea of blackened brambles and curling tendrils that grasped at cloaks and hooves alike. Korik's mechanical arm cast a dull glow through the undergrowth, but even her sophisticated sensors could barely penetrate the spore-dense gloom. They moved in tight formation, Beam led, gnarled limbs parting the fungal thicket as his spores created a protective halo around them. Alert. Patience. Blue brought up the rear, axe at the ready for anything that slithered or sprouted in their path. Marken and Korik kept close, eyes darting for movement. Before an hour had passed, the first ambush struck. A cluster of bloom spiders, 8-legged horrors whose carapaces pulsed with neon green mold, fell from the canopy like living fruit. Korik leapt aside, slashing one spider's thorax with her scalpel blade, while Marken loosed a volley of arrows upward at the falling arachnids. Beam spun, his spores flaring white, devouring the fungus flesh, out of 2 more before they collapsed. 3 survivors lunged at Blue. He cleaved them through the carapace with brutal efficiency. In less than a minute, the woods went silent once more, the betraying rustle of mold settling back into the branches. Each breath came with a cough of fetid spores. Corrick paused to spray them with an acid wash, wiping her lenses clear. "We cannot allow this attrition to persist," she muttered, studying her wrist rig. "I predict an escalation in the specimen's virulence the deeper we penetrate." They pressed on, hours blurred into a relentless march over half-collapsed fallen logs and rank air. Markin found his footing on a battered stump and paused to survey the land. "No sign of a trail," he said. "Only this endless rot." A sudden crash echoed ahead. They crept forward to find a grove of pod trees, its floor teeming with fungal wargs, wolf-like beasts, whose breath misted with spores so dense it sickened the air. 7 of them snarled from a tight circle, eyes glowing faint green. Blue braced for impact as the lead warg barreled toward them. Corrick calibrated her arm-mounted harpoon with a swift click, then released it into the creature's neck, the tether snagging a nearby tree as it charged on, wrenching it to a halt in a ragged tangle of rope and beast. Before they could recover, a second warg sprang at Markin's flank. Its jaws tore away flesh as the beast shook violently. Markin collapsed with a strangled cry, blood pooling at his side and poison flaring through his system. Beam abandoned his assault and dropped to one knee, plunging his arms into the loamy earth. Roots burst forth from beneath the snarling warg, tearing its head from its shoulders in a tangle of blood and mycelium. He whirled, cleansing spores searing the fungal pelt of another warg as it lunged for him. Blue's axe arced in a storm of steel. 2 wargs cleaved in half, blue sparks lacing out to immobilize a third. Corrick rushed to Markin, tearing a vial of emerald tincture from her belt. She poured it into his open wound. The poison hissed and smoked as his flesh itself burned. The flow of blood halted. Markin inhaled sharply, pressing a hand to his side. "Thank you," he rasped, eyes meeting hers with fierce gratitude. The last warg slunk into the shadows, wounded but alive. Their bodies ached and lungs burned, but the old grove awaited. Beam knelt amid the trampled undergrowth and exhaled a billow of phosphorescent spores, emerald and amber motes that drifted across bruised flesh and torn skin, knitting sinew and sealing lacerations with gentle precision. Around them the forest's hush felt charged, as though the grove itself awaited their arrival. As they crested a rise, the air thinned, and light fell in mottled beams through twisted branches. Ahead lay a small clearing. The grove beckoned, massive oaks, twice the height of any they'd seen, their trunks grotesquely warped, large blackened roots coiling like ancient serpents across the leaf-littered floor. Markin swallowed. His pulse thundered in his ears. Corrick studied her map for a few moments. "Positional data confirms our arrival," he said softly. "Moral Grove." For a heartbeat, the clearing was still. Too still. Then the ground trembled. One oak shuddered, its knotted limbs uncurling like arthritic claws. A second followed. Soon the entire grove convulsed in synchronized motion, roots ripping free, branches creaking into stride. The forest itself had risen. From the shadowed understory came a gaunt lion, with limbs unnaturally lengthened and a pulsating crown of fungal carapace. Behind it, a hulking abomination of muscle and thick mycelial rope weave, its arms ending in flensing blades of fungal chitin. They emerged in unison with a twisted, malformed humanoid whose each breath unleashed a cloud of spores, while its maw snapped open in a rasping shriek. 9 more figures, every limb twisted into fungal growths, spilled into the clearing, their hollow eyes moving in unison. Markin raised his bow, Corrick her scalpel rig. Blue hefted his axe, and Beam knelt, his head bowed, spores flickering at his barkskin. This was no scattered horde. Each creature moved in perfect, dreadful synchronicity. as though the grove itself directed them. Then a distant thunder cleaved the haze. A tremor of draconic roars rolled in from the east. The twisted tableau paused, spores hanging frozen in the air, as 7 true dragons, scales gleaming like burnished steel, surged over the horizon in immaculate formation. Their wings beat an ancient war song that shook leaves from branches. At their forefront rode a figure, a lone rider perched atop a regal golden dragon. Light trailed from his outstretched hand, pale and commanding, illuminating the grove's advancing legions in stark relief. The abominations hesitated, the living trees wavered in their advance, and all at once every branch, every root, every fungal horror froze in that charged moment of reckoning. Markin's throat went dry, Korik's rig flickered, spore readings peaked. Blue's axe felt impossibly heavy in his grip. Beam exhaled, spores pulsing in ancient rhythm. Agony. Family. Home. In the hush before the storm, the 2 forces faced off across the clearing, one born of rot and assimilation, the other of fire and light, destiny gleaming on golden scales. And then the rider raised his hand, and the moral grove paused again. Blue's hand went slack on the haft of his axe as the rider's incantation pierced the air, each word resonating with a familiar cadence. By the seas. That's Mr. E, Blue growled, voice pounding with disbelief. Markin's eyes were fixed to the center of the grove, where the abominations and walking oaks had paused their march. There, stepping through the pulsating roots and writhing tendrils, stood Cassandra, pale as moonlight, her hair matted with spore dust, yet unmistakably her. She paused beneath the towering oaks, heart hammering in Markin's chest, and the world held its breath. Thanks for listening to War Beneath the Roots. If you enjoyed the story so far, consider following or subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep your blade sharp and your fire burning.